Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a world where people are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That principle has always guided me, and many of the people of London Fanshawe feel that current DEI policies are taking us further from it.
In Canada, EDI is currently taking up far too much focus in each of the granting agencies, rather than prioritizing research excellence, and they're too often promoting and even rewarding political activism.
DEI is supposed to create this, fair and inclusive environment that is supposed to address injustices of marginalized groups. Do you think that it actually has the opposite of effect of actually marginalizing those who don't adhere to a certain ideological viewpoint?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
We are joined in person here by Imogen Kyo, Professor, Department of Chemistry and Biology from Toronto Metropolitan University. We are also joined by Mark Green, Professor from Queen's University. We are joined by Dave Snow, Associate Professor, University of Guelph, by video conference, and also Partnership for Women's Health Research Canada is represented by Tamil Kendall, Director.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a world where people are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That principle has always guided me, and many of the people of London Fanshawe feel that current DEI policies are taking us further from it. They want opportunities based on merit and ability. Yet academics warn that funding rules are closing doors and rewarding conformity instead of excellence. I hope this study helps us find a better path and restores fairness, protects freedom, and ensures taxpayer dollars support the best ideas. My question is for Dr. Snow. You mentioned in your piece from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute that the current federal government, which you hold responsible for the DEI push, is not interested in rolling back DEI. What would you say are the most dire consequences of granting agencies and post-secondary institutions continuing down this DEI path?
Thank you for the question. And I should note that this report came out in February of 2025. And so when speaking about the current government, of course, it was still a Liberal government, but it was under a different prime minister. I'm unaware of any shift or maintenance in terms of the current government's priorities in terms of this language. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I think that and perhaps I say this, perhaps I'm biased in saying this as an academic and as someone who has spent his entire adult life in the university, but I worry that it contributes to the undermining of our post-secondary institutions. I think when people see this type of language, quite frankly, when people hear the amount of money, right? When I tell, bright people I know who aren't engaged in the post-secondary sector that these granting agencies distribute $4 billion and more a year, they're shocked. Now, that doesn't mean that that is not a good use of taxpayer dollars, but quite frankly, these sorts of activist projects are the ones that make the headlines more than the, even within the social science, sort of really knowledge-creating, objective, falsifiable research. So I think it speaks to a potential and growing disillusion with the post-secondary sector amongst the Canadian public, and that's what I worry about the most, because these agencies do very important work, but these particular grants are unfortunately undermining it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Snow. I share your concerns, and I know many Canadians also. In that same piece, you provide several recommendations for reversing the effects of DEI. Can you tell more about the reforms you believe would restore genuine openness, protect diversity of opinion, and ensure merit and freedom of thought before ideological conformity?
Yes, absolutely. And the first one, and it's small. It would be a line in two different pieces of, or three different pieces of legislation, which is just committing the federal granting agencies to political and ideological neutrality. And if it's in their legislative mandate, it would make it difficult, of course not impossible, but difficult for the agencies to go down with these explicitly politicized grants. In addition, I recommend obviously eliminating these explicitly EDI-focused grants, which quite frankly, I think most people who hear about them are in agreement with that recommendation. But perhaps a little more controversially, I recommend removing all references to equity, diversity, and inclusion from the granting agency's website and supporting materials because of the slippage, because calls for inclusion in a research team can move to calls for political activism so quickly. And so I think that some of the things the other witnesses spoke about today, about saying we want grants that have, for example, that study diverse populations, we can put that in granting criterias without having the language of EDI and EDI action plans transposed over all three granting agencies. So I think we can be more targeted and more specific about what we're looking for, and that the language of EDI doesn't allow us to do that. It's so fuzzy, it enables researchers to sort of move in any direction, and most troublingly, in an activist direction with their research.
Thank you. In previous testimony, we have heard stories from academics who have seen DEI policies inhibit the careers of budding academics who do not fit the DEI mold. We have also heard stories about these policies being used to bolster the careers of established academics at the expense of young academics. What message do you think it sends to young Canadian researchers if they learn that conformity to an ideology matters more than the strength of their ideas? Dr. Snow?
I think that the most important and unfortunate message it sends is that you are going to get more research money and more prestige if you perform this type of research. And so what I'm dismayed often to see is excellent young graduate students who could be at the frontiers of science and social sciences, studying arcane, EDI-focused language with no potential impact.
Time is up. So,
NSERC looks at excellence, so excellence of the researcher, proposed research, and HQP. But on excellence of the researcher, for example, it's defined very differently with Indigenous knowledge and with Indigenous keepers. So how can we be mindful about the way we are assessing research excellence when we're working with different communities? Because doing it based on publications, for example, that's not the right measure. So how can we make sure that we're including research excellence when it may not have a traditional metric?
Yes, thanks for bringing up that about cultural leaders and cultural knowledge, in a way, having the expertise. And there is some movement to be looking at recognizing that knowledge that exists through those oral traditions, through other knowledge that does not exist outside of that place knowledge and those systems. So it's actually different perspectives, different knowledge, and it can also bring with it a lot of changes and understandings. There are ways then to look at, well, what is the impact in community? How are these people recognized in community? Many of the people who have this knowledge, they may not have traditional education, but they are respected for their knowledge because they are knowledge keepers, et cetera. So there are many other ways of looking more broadly, and certainly those are the things in working with the Indigenous Leadership Circle on Research, which is a national body, as well as a reference group on appropriate review of Indigenous research. Both of those bodies are looking closely at those types of ways of.
You spoke quite a bit about political activism with the current ideologies in federal funding agencies of research and academia, but you did give us a glimpse of hope that the harm today is not reparable, but we must take action. If we as the government do not take action now, what will be the repercussions in our scientific community, especially in areas like Waterloo, where we still do have science excellence happening today?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one. And the first thing I should say is that, I am a social scientist, a political scientist, and so my knowledge of, for example, the hard science environment in places like Waterloo is not is not particularly high. But I do think I would emphasize something I touched on briefly towards the end, which is that I think these granting agencies, mostly fund a great deal of research, and I found far more limited evidence of this activist EDI at NSERC, for example. But I think in an era of increased financial restraint, of large budget deficits, that the perception, and as I've shown in my report, the at times justified perception that what these agencies are doing is not funding objective new knowledge, not funding knowledge creation, but instead funding ideological projects where activists are just continuing to do activism, but with more federal government money. Then I think the appetite from the public and from legislators is going to be to move away from this and saying that's an area where I think we can and should cut. And I think that would be a shame. So that's why I'm suggesting reform to avoid those potential cuts down the line.
I agree completely. I think too there's a risk of losing faith in our service, in our research excellence, and losing really not having any trust in our science anymore if we continue down these paths. And that's what I wanted to bring up with you today. In the Waterloo region, we have very good scientific achievements happening, but I'm afraid that'll be eroded in time if we continue down this path, these ideological paths. Can you explain further where that would have that erosion in science if we continue down this course?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, first and foremost, the sort of creeping integration of more EDI activist requirements into large-scale grants is an issue. So if we want to fund the best research, we should fund the best research. We shouldn't fund the best research that also makes vague commitments to activist EDI and base research funding for things like hard science and engineering's projects on the basis of those statements. But I also think, and again, I'm seeing this less in NSERC, more in SRC, and surprisingly more in CIHR than I expected in terms of its guidelines anyway, is that we're actually carving out research dollars for explicitly activist projects in the social sciences and humanities in particular. So we're not only saying that we encourage researchers to build their research proposals in such a way that makes a nod to equity, diversity, and inclusion, is more likely to be funded if it's equity, diversity, inclusion. But we're actually taking scarce taxpayer dollars and saying these grants are only for activist projects. And if you look at the language in things like the knowledge synthesis grants at SRC and the Race, Gender, and Diversity Initiative, which has ended, but it was quite a large sum of money and a lot of $450,000 grants, that's what I found overwhelmingly within those grants. The percentages I found of activist projects being within the SRC main insight grants was between 10 and 15% with explicitly activist language in its title. Now that's a lot higher than I think should be coming from a federal granting agency, but it's not 100. With those more explicitly activist grants, it was more like 2/3 in terms of that. So I think that first and foremost, we pare down the guidelines, we maintain a commitment to ideological and political neutrality, and we say that we're going to stop carving out scarce taxpayer resources for grants that are about activism. If the government wants to fund activism, it can fund activism. It shouldn't be doing it through its research granting agencies.
Thank you very much for that. One last thing is I'm going to cite you here for a second. In Canada, EDI is currently taking up far too much focus in each of the granting agencies rather than prioritizing research excellence, and they're too often promoting and even rewarding political activism. You drew me right into this exact site here. To you, what is the most critical step to reduce politicalization in academia and to ensure we're funding authentic research?
Yeah, that is a great question because it raises the question of whether or not these granting agencies are upstream or downstream of broader tendencies within academia, especially the social sciences and humanities, towards more ideological research and less.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up. Maybe you can respond in the next round. So.
federal government funding a criteria will bring more women and indigenous in civil engineering, especially in civil engineering field, because we don't see too many women in civil engineering field.
Certainly, you're right. There are lower proportions of women in civil engineering, although partly in, say, the environmental aspects of civil engineering, et cetera. These are areas, and we're having more, even in our universities, we are having more women professors. At Waterloo, Mary Wells is the Dean of Engineering there. Charmaine Dean is, as a woman, is the Vice President of Research leading that. So very strong. I was just at McMaster last week to welcome my colleague Susan Tai, who is the new president at McMaster. Got a special congratulations and invitation from our Premier Doug Ford in that message for everything that she's doing for Ontario and advancing science and infrastructure and civil engineering in Canada. So these are things that are incredible to see that are also part of some of these broader initiatives.
Cool. What are some of the major EDI initiatives that you implemented and you found very successful?
Building on what Dr. Green has said, I think NSERC has really raised the awareness of the fact that there is talent being left on the sidelines, and that's a deficit, that's a cost to Canada. So I think we want to be really ensuring that we are mobilizing talent and we're creating those inclusive cultures deliberately and intentionally so that we can leverage that creativity and that talent.
Sorry for interrupting, time is up.
Yeah, my question is for Professor Snow. I'm going to go back to the basics. DEI is supposed to create this, fair and inclusive environment that is supposed to address injustices of marginalized groups. Do you think that it actually has the opposite of effect of actually marginalizing those who don't adhere to a certain ideological viewpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of especially what I call the more activist form of EDI has that effect. I don't doubt that decades ago, requirements for inclusion or suggestions for inclusion had the effect of bringing people in. But I think we're increasingly seeing, and you've seen witnesses this week talk about how we're excluding particular types of research by this. What I see in the EDI requirements is a narrowing in terms of the scope of federally funded research in the areas where EDI applies, and that's really the opposite of what EDI was supposed to originally be about.
Just like every liberal policy, it achieves the opposite disastrous effect. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. We will now go to MP Jessic for a quick 1 minute round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Kendall, you've heard Professor Snow and some of his criticisms around EDI. Are you aware of this activist EDI agenda that is apparently there in Professor Snow's opinion to promote a political agenda? Have you seen any of this in the work that you've been doing?
I must say that I don't believe that there is an activist agenda in trying to figure out how we can make our health services and our health research welcoming to populations that experience racial discrimination, that experience ableism, and that experience a history of colonialism. So I think that these structural issues are important to address, and that research that addresses them moves us forward in promoting the health of all Canadians.